Congress passes a huge, sweeping new program, but has no clue how to actually implement it. What is this, 1935? The expert hired by the Social Security Board, Harry Hoff, had been a management consultant for private life insurance companies. This is great. They dealt with many insurees, right? They know how to do this. So thought the Assistant Secretary of Labor in charge of Social Security. This was a guy that all the life insurance companies, when the government wanted to run Social Security, they went to life insurance companies and asked for help. They all said, you've got to get this man Hoff. He's helped us to operate better. He's increased our capacity. He's a genius. The answer that came back, though, was disappointing. Hoff's answer was, you have to drop this idea of Social Security. It's unworkable. You have 28 million workers in the United States at the time. You don't know where they're working. You don't know who they are. 2.5 million more are going to get added each year. You've got to have everything ready to send them a check when the time comes. The federal government at this point doesn't even know their names. Once they do, you've got multiple John Smiths. You've got multiple Bob Jones, people with the same name. Plus, you've got a limited office, a limited staff. It's never going to work. Drop the program. That wasn't going to happen. No one on the Social Security Board, the entity created by the legislation to run Social Security, wanted to drop the program. Congress wanted it. There was third-party urging for the Social Security program. Indeed, a California congressman had introduced his own Social Security bill 24 hours before the president's. This was a bill based on the idea of the Townsend Clubs, the very popular group of the 1930s, older Americans joining together in clubs to lobby for pensions, kind of the AARP of their day. The clubs were lobbying with the hope that each older American in the United States would get a $200 a month pension. This would enable them to leave the jobs and would flood the economy with new dollars. Townsend clubs were serious business. In a few elections, Townsend congressional candidates were winning the elections. No time to abandon the program and open the president and congressmen to third-party challenges. 1936 is coming up, an election year. When McGrawdy's bill came into the hopper, FDR had to use political capital to kill his bill. Think about that. Franklin Roosevelt killing a Social Security bill. The president sent a message to Congress. It is important to avoid any danger of permanently discrediting the sound and necessary policy of federal legislation for economic security by attempting to apply it on too ambitious a scale. Roosevelt's bill was more conservative than the Townsend Club plan. A worker would get, upon turning 65, 40% of up to $150 a month that they earned for the rest of their life. So as you can see, Social Security was a lot lower than the schemes that were desired. One of the reasons that Huey Long, senator from Louisiana, filibustered the act. He wanted a far more generous program. In fact, he wanted something akin to Social Security for everyone. For that reason, Hoff's recommendation to the board could not be followed, and they told Hoff, get back to the drawing board. There was pressure on the right, too. The likely Republican candidate for president, Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, was out on the stump saying that Social Security was a fraud on the working man that would never be completed. When he heard of the problems with the government figuring out how to keep track of workers, he attached that to his message, too. Will we all be fingerprinted? Landon joked. Will they attach tags around our necks? So make this work, Hoff, they said. Hoff figured out you could not do this program with names. Make a number. And if you do, say, 111111111, 9 digits, it'll be enough for 1 billion different permutations, different people. That leaves a lot of room for the growth of the United States. In fact, Hoff's system still works pretty well. We can adjust the numbers so that the first 2 numbers will tell where the person is from. That way we can file more appropriately. Plus, we're going to develop a new office. There's going to be about an acre. There's going to be an office the size of an acre filled with files organized according to location where people can quickly find the cards that they need. And Hoff's system would eventually allow for, even before the days of computers, to allow for a government worker to find an appropriate card within a matter of seconds. But how do you get to the people? How do you get these cards? Federal government right now has very few methods of reaching people unless they're paying them a military pension. Well, you could try going through the states, but then as of now, you're not going to get cooperation from all the states, and there might be constitutional problems with compelling states to hand over a list. Besides, not everybody's on state pension rolls anyway. State pensions in these days are paltry. Alf Landon's in Kansas could be as little as $1.08 a week. So how do you reach all of the workers that you want to give Social Security to? Well, there's one entity of the federal government that reaches all Americans in 1936, and that's the post office. There are 45,000 post offices, many more are letter carriers. Sohoff said they could get applications to the workers, then get those applications to central typing offices, type up a card, and then give it to the Social Security office in Baltimore, and a second copy would be typed up that would go to the worker. But this wasn't the only glitch. The Social Security Act called for a tax of 1% of every worker's earnings. 1% now, upon the passage of the legislation, well, in 1937, 2 years staggered. That would go up to 3% by 1949. That 1% deduction from payroll would start in 1937, and it would be accompanied by a 1% deduction from the business as well. 1% from the employer, 1% from the business. But not a single Social Security check from the federal government would be issued until 1942. In the meantime, the act would beef up those paltry state pension programs, but not add to them sufficiently. This meant that the first experience workers had with Social Security was a tax on the paycheck. And you might imagine the reaction to that. Employers began posting notes in break rooms, inserting slips into pay envelopes saying, "You are sentenced to a weekly pay reduction for all of your work life." And in a bid to help Alf Landon, running in 1936, "You will have to serve the sentence unless you help reverse it on November 3rd. It went on. Effective January 1st, 1937, we are compelled to make a 1% reduction from your wages and turn it over to the government. You might get back this money in the future years, but only if Congress makes an appropriation for this purpose. There is no guarantee." As you can imagine, this stirred up workers a little bit, getting this in their pay envelopes. Alf Landon was out on the campaign trail calling it a 6% tax. He was going to the 1949 rate, 3%, and including both the employer contribution and the worker contribution. So he called it a 6% tax. FDR fired back. "I want to say a word also to the wage earners who are finding propaganda in their pay envelopes. The fund necessary to provide that security is not collected only from workers. It's also collected from the employer." The Social Security Board jumped in. They had wanted to stay out of the election, but after the pay slip envelopes that workers were getting, they decided to do a flyer and the propaganda of the 1930s, the newsreel. They made their point that the annuity that Social Security would provide was better than any that the worker could get from a private insurance company. Essentially, you're going to get out more than you put in. The election went on, and as Landon had considered it a political issue, the election became, among other things, a referendum on Social Security. Alf Landon moderated his statement during the election. "I am not saying that the purpose of the law is bad, but I will not promise the moon, economy, a living pension, and such security as can be had by a generous people is all I can promise." Alf Landon lost the election, winning only the states of Maine and Vermont, and the resulting mandate killed any effort to eliminate Social Security. Eventually, amendments would kill that 3% tax plan. And with the boom in the economy of World War II, there was enough money coming into the Social Security system that they did not have to increase the tax at that point. And by 1949, when the tax had been slated to go to 3%, it was still 1% employer, 1% worker. Well, the first thing that strikes me is that rollout problems are to be expected with any large program. There was a big debate about a reserve fund that was supposed to be created with the Social Security legislation. Thought it would add to the deficit. That was never created. They didn't need to because of the post-World War II boom. it wasn't necessary to create a reserve fund. That was a big debate. There were constitutional challenges that had to go before the Supreme Court, but it was a more favorable Supreme Court by the time the legislation was enacted. So Social Security faced constitutional challenges, staff challenges, logistical glitches, opposition from businesses, a doubt about a scheme that involved current taxes and future payments. That all sounds very familiar. President Obama's healthcare reform, PPACA, called Obamacare, which I find quite interesting. You can't imagine Roosevelt or Johnson, calling it Roosevelt Security or Johnson Care. The name Social Security was greatly considered for the brand effect. It was originally economic security, but proponents wanted to demonstrate the positive social effects that would happen if you introduced pensions for older citizens. But dare I embrace the term Obamacare that's out there? Now there are issues with the prices, with cancellations of current policies, website crashes, confusing plans and choices. In some cases, especially those who had high deductible plans, are now going without coverage for legislation that's supposed to instill universal coverage. Prices are going up in some cases, for others it's going down. Many glitches, with the result that finally integrity questions are now aimed at the Oval Office because President Obama had assured Americans that you would not need to change your plan, not need to change your doctor. And now some amount of Americans will need to do that. Well, first, it's necessary to say that there is a pattern of the federal government not being ready for the launch of big programs. Medicare was launched. Everyone expected this magic sign-up coming in, right? Everybody would enroll that needed to enroll. Well, no. 1 million enrolled by the end of 1965 after the passage of the legislation out of 25 million that they expected who were eligible. Now, Medicare was a very good deal at the time, but it wasn't free. It's not free now. There was $3 a month premium for it. So older citizens had to actually volunteer and sign up, and they didn't. So the government had to revamp, staff up, a huge, larger office now in Baltimore for the CMS, sent out mailings, brought in staff from other departments, and eventually got 12 million, still not the full amount, by January 1966, but enough to make the program work, to make it relevant to doctors and hospitals. Medicare isn't exactly a program like Obamacare, but at the base, there has to be a certain amount involved for the program to work. Doctors aren't going to start accepting things or be ready to accept something if there's only a few people in the program. Nixon and the Congress at the time expanded Social Security to SSI, taking over the disability and survivor benefits from states. Now, it's no longer the 30s, and it's not the mid-60s. It's 1970, 1971, and D.C. had a computer system, a data acquisition center that would take up a room, but nonetheless a computer. But the computer, as it turned out, couldn't handle all the questions and claims and requests for verification of claims that were coming in from the SSI field offices. They had to verify if the person was eligible, if the claim was worthy of payment. Field offices couldn't handle the request, and claimants were waiting months. States had to step in until the program could be improved. There was also sign-up issues with that. Half the people that they expected to sign up for SSI did. Recently, with Medicare Part D, there were glitches in services, and states, once again, had to come in and fill in the gap while the federal government program solved its glitches. There were tens of thousands of complaints, and half the sign-up expected when the legislation was passed. So the first thing that strikes me here is that obviously rollout problems are to be expected with any large program. I mean, you'd think they'd get better at this with the website issues with healthcare.gov, etc. You'd think for an administration that prides itself as being part of the internet generation, it's disappointing to see website issues like that. In addition to improving rollout programs, I think the federal government always has a problem, which should be obvious, with sales. And I think they probably need to partner with some kind of a sales company when they launch any kind of program. It's really I think history can help out with. I mean, government does not do sales very well. It's a private sector activity. Legislation in the future He needs to consider that. It seems like Congress just passes legislation and expects everyone to come to them and sign up. It's a very Washingtonian mentality. No, if you need to get something from customers, even if they are voters and citizens, you need to illustrate it to them that it's to their benefit. And that does involve agents, some kind of sales representatives, to get them to sign up. Well, I don't think the history of glitches with programs should excuse a poor rollout, especially in today's time and with the technology that we have. It's really an own goal for the president there, something that I think will hurt him in 2014. I mean, I'm going to have to try to make some fixes here, but I can't see where it doesn't hurt. And unlike President Roosevelt, the political situation that President Obama's in is he's not lucky to have a 2012 election as a referendum on the program and the rollout. Because then, even if it's not fair and a president is more likely to win a presidential election, even if it's not fair, it might be a big issue in the election. You win the presidential election, you claim mandate for everything, and you're fine. He doesn't have that. The election has passed. The rollout is now. It's 2014 that will be the next referendum. That's usually not good for an incumbent president, so you can almost see what's coming here, right? You can go back and listen to some of my old casts in 2010. I do have the archive on www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Archive's available for $25.99. You can go back and listen to some of the casts from 2010. I personally have never been enamored with the Obamacare concept or the idea of getting everybody into a common pool. Some of that is from the long view, having read a lot about history and policy implementation in the United States. And I said at the time, I still feel we're much better at solving individual parts of problems than solving a big problem like universal care for all Americans. Most American policy has been to solve one part: children through the CHIP program, seniors through Medicare. The Congress mandates payment of dialysis payments, for instance. So there's all these little parts, and I think that you sum it up and add it to a whole. So there could have been my suggestion, for instance, is that the government could pay for cancer treatment, thereby hopefully the government's taking that bill, reducing the cost of private insurance for everything else, while filling a national need that would also give a president a nice legacy moment. It seemed to me in 2010 that there was this, we got to pass something mentality. This is what you got. And I do think there'll be some trouble down the road implementing it. There was a lot of statements about, by passing the bill, this was a big moment for President Obama's legacy. I do think now that history to look back and say that was a great achievement, it also has to work. So there's the passage of legislation, but then it also has to work, and people in their average everyday lives have to experience a benefit. If costs are going up significantly for a lot of people, and cost of premiums had been going up, so this isn't new, that's not going to be a big boost to a president's legacy or a grand achievement on the scale of the New Deal, a great society. So definitely going to need fixes to the program. And Medicare was created with tremendous opposition from the American Medical Association. Doctors at one point threatened a boycott until they were forced to comply, and then decided it was to their benefit to comply. Social Security was enacted in a very partisan atmosphere, both on the left and the right in that case, pushing in both directions. Not enough, too much. This is a very partisan atmosphere as well, and it's difficult to see how something will get fixed through this, but sides can get together and not shut down the government. Maybe there's a group that can get together and provide some fixes to this legislation. But the fixes won't be easy, because I think, for instance, still not enamored with the mandate, as sure a lot of Americans aren't. I'd rather see some kind of individual opt-out, but it's a hard opt-out. So if you opt out of the program, you have to pay for your medical bills. You could face bankruptcy, etc. So we allow people the freedom to do that, but if they make that choice, then they are paying. Now no government's going to pay for your emergency room bill, something like that. I think there's fixes like that are going to be needed for the program. I'm not sure that Washington's in an atmosphere to do it. Suppose one is an idiot, and suppose one is a member of Congress. But I repeat myself. That's what Mark Twain once said. It's not an easy job. Congressmen do take a lot of punishment and ridicule. Take former Speaker of the House Tom Foley, who passed away recently. He served 15 terms as the congressman for Western Washington State District. That meant a life of flying around in small planes to Spokane, to Walla Walla, to Colfax, and meet in town hall meetings, answering questions from farmers about exports. Big Tom, as he was called in his district, son of a judge, Big Tom, as he was called, son of a judge in Spokane, made a point of not doing the flannel or denim that sometimes you see candidates go out there looking like his constituents. It didn't matter if he was at the Downriver Festival in Lone, Washington, or he's at Dulles Airport. A man wore a suit. Tom Foley passed away in October. Well-respected Speaker of the House. Took over after Jim Wright, who was seen as a very divisive speaker. We could use more Tom Foleys, Newt Gingrich said. Forthright and warm-hearted, John Boehner said. We were pupils of the old school, Robert Mitchell said, former majority leader of the Republicans. Newt Gingrich talked about how after he was defeated for the speakership, second speaker to be voted out of office, he assisted Newt Gingrich in learning the rules of the House so he could be a good speaker and do an adequate job, and that's not something that Gingrich forgot. Tom Foley was the second Speaker of the House we mentioned to be defeated for his own re-election in 1994. He had allowed a vote on assault weapons ban, gone to court to sue his state because the state had instituted term limits. And in 94, the politics of the district caught up with him, and he lost. So that begs the question, though, who was the first speaker to lose election? See, it's not all that common. Usually you pick a speaker from a very safe district. And when you don't, well, what can happen might be what happened to Galusha Grow. He was a man who couldn't have been speaker in any other moment. Grow was a radical. He wanted two things: abolition of slavery and, not that radical now, but radical at the time, and the Homestead Act, to allow land for immigrants out west, land provided by the government. Abraham Lincoln called the 37th Congress into session July 4th, 1861. This is a Congress under duress. A quarter of the membership of the House of Representatives were secessionists, and they walked out. The speech that Grow gave upon accepting the speakership, and he was backed by Thaddeus Stevens and some of the other radical Republicans in the House, that's how he got the speakership, made reference to beating the secessionists and filling the Mississippi with gore. You could make this kind of speech in 1861. By 1862, when the midterms hit, the war was not as popular in the North. The conscription was certainly not popular. Some of the moves that Abraham Lincoln had made regarding suspension of habeas corpus, for instance, were not popular. And Abraham Lincoln had made his first announcement of a to-be-determined Emancipation Proclamation right before the midterms, and Grow was caught up in that and lost his seat in Pennsylvania. One of the things Galusha Grow, though, had passed was a Homestead Act. The Homestead Act would provide for government lands out west to be settled by settlers in the east, and if they settled the land, they could own it. It resulted in 1.6 million homesteads 30 years later, when as an 80-year-old, Galusha Grow was reelected to Congress by the state of Pennsylvania in 1894. That Homestead Act was a radical program. Many might have said, well, it's the federal government's land. Let's get money from it. Let's sell it. Let's put it on auction and sell it to wealthy developers. Why give it away? But that was a different vision that the United States Congress had, and it does reflect where sometimes in a discussion about how the government was in the past, the idea that in the past it was always smaller government thinking. That's certainly true of money, but it's not necessarily true of another asset that the government had, which was land. So the federal government was small by today's standards in terms of money. It collected its revenues through tariffs and fees and whiskey taxes and things like that. But when it came to land, the government was quite generous. And the Homestead Act shows it to a more communal attitude, but also one rooted in the individuality of America. So it is, you get a piece of land if you work it, but it's not a complete freebie. It fit well with the frontier mentality and fit well with America. Scott Greenberg writes in the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics fan site on Facebook, fans of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, piggybacking off the Revolutionary War stuff, this would be my favorite ephemera of all time. Queen Elizabeth's bicentennial speech in Philadelphia. I think it's interesting, Scott, so let's look at it. 1976, Philadelphia, the Queen of the United Kingdom, Queen Elizabeth II, comes to Philadelphia, comes to the United States. This is a huge deal, and she bears a bell. And the bell is made from the same factory as the Liberty Bell. And she makes this speech, July 4th. I speak to you as the direct descendant of King George III. He was the last crown sovereign to rule in this country, and it's therefore with a particular personal interest that I view those events that took place 200 years ago. It seems to me that Independence Day, the 4th of July, should be celebrated as much in Britain as in America. Not in rejoicing at the separation of the American colonies from the British Crown, but in sincere gratitude to the founding fathers of this great republic for having taught Britain a very valuable lesson. We lost the American colonies because we lacked that statesmanship to know the right time and the manner of yielding what isn't possible to keep. But the lesson was learned. In the next century and a half, we kept more closely to the principles of Magna Carta, which have been the common heritage of both our countries. We learned to respect the rights of others to govern themselves in their own ways. This was the outcome of experience learned the hard way in 1776. Without that great act in the cause of liberty, performed in Independence Hall 200 years ago, we could never have transformed an empire into a commonwealth. Ultimately, peace brought a renewal of friendship which has continued and grown over the years and played a vital part in world affairs. Together, we have fought in 2 world wars in the defense of our common heritage of freedom. Her speech, made at the southeast corner of 3rd and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia, where much revolutionary activity would have gone on, is striking. And I have to say, prior to being made aware of this little piece of trivia, I wasn't really that. We had a statement from a sovereign that we're sorry, but maybe you guys were right, and thank you for teaching us an important lesson about democracy. I wasn't actually aware that there was a statement from the British government that we handled that thing kind of wrong. So there you have it. You have it in 1976. We don't need it. We've done a good job running things, but in spite of shutdowns here or there, we've done a pretty good job of running things. But good to know. Good to know that they feel that way. I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Archive is there, $25.99. You get all the episodes from the past. We've talked about a lot of history and politics. If you do like the program, please tell someone about it. I'm available on Twitter at myhist, MYHIST. Thanks for listening.